मेरी ते बोलती बंद कर दी, फिर तुसी कहंदे बोलो। Azam ji, good evening.
Hanji, greetings to you.
You're joining us from where?
From France.
You're from France, okay.
Yes.
Has anyone ever told you that you look like Khayyam?
Look like a?
Khayyam.
Khayyam.
The music director.
Prominent personality in the field of music.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I am more of a consumer, and I often tend to ignore the producers. And I'm an old man, so my needle is stuck on the old singers. I listen to the new ones, I enjoy them. I don't really know about the composers' names apart from the gentleman who got an Oscar, the one who's from.
Rahman.
Yes, he's a world star, so I know his name.
But Khayyam is a very old music director.
I don't think I ever took much of an interest in the music composers.
Okay.
Except when it was like the name would be floating in the air, and I'd retain it for a short while, and then it would go away. I'm supposed to kind of keep quiet and let you ask your questions now.
Do you think he looks like Khayyam?
He resembles.
Thank you. I'm very flattered. I have also been compared with a whole lot of other things, so this is so much better. Thank you very much.
Hi Poonam, good evening.
Just a second, I have muted her. She cannot reply me. Now she can.
Poonam, आपका network की problem आएगी फिर से. Your video is very erratic. आप पहली network check.
No, actually, I have actually just changed the network. I should not be, because normally I am doing Zoom meetings. I don't know. Maybe it is. I don't know. How is it sounding today, Abhi? Just now.
No, the audio is fine. Audio is fine, but video रुक के आ रहा है आपका.
I don't know how to do it. I have a
Wi-Fi पे shift हो जाओ.
Wi-Fi पे ही हूँ मैं.
अच्छा Wi-Fi पे ही हो. Okay. चमक साहब है ना problem in the videos? The audio is fine.
I told her.
हाँ.
Audio is clear?
Audio is clear. Audio is clear.
Okay.
So Preeti ji, please unmute yourself so that we can start. Yeah. It's only 6:05.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We have this new edition now today of Once Upon a Story. We actually started this more like a reading group, and something that was created for the members of Majha House to come in and either tell a story, which is their own story written by themselves, or then read out a story, something by a writer that they like. It's also been working much like a collective library where we can ask you to pull down your favorite book and share it with us. So we can all actually really enjoy this listening and this time of hearing what you're telling us, because I think stories connect in so many ways, and the art of storytelling is as ancient as mankind or womankind, and through the centuries we've enjoyed stories, sitting together listening. I think we all have stories to tell. I think we all are stories also, aren't we? And stories allow us to escape our own lives and enter into others' lives. They also help us to make sense of the world, to learn, to understand, to engage, and to make connections with others whom we may not otherwise have. So let's once again open our ears and open our hearts to 4 new storytellers, bringing to us 4 new stories. Gurpratap is going to tell us a little bit about each of the people who are reading to us today.
Well, thank you, Preeti. I guess that was my cue. We went to this wonderful session where we have had brilliant storytellers who narrated stories by very famous writers, and some they were by their own. And we have had a very encouraging response from all of you. And we are glad that you could tune in again. Today we have 4 wonderful people who will be narrating to us their own different stories, their favorite stories. And the first reader that we have today is Deepa Swani. Deepa Swani successfully runs a trading business which she has been in her family since 1860 and promotes sustainable farming through it. She is the president of Pulkari, a leading women's organization in Amritsar, and also develops and heads its philanthropic learning program for lesser privileged children. She has conducted reading workshops and theatre for children. She is the scriptwriter for an amateur theatre group called Theatrewalas. And she loves to travel and she loves to read. So the first reader for today, Deepa Swani. Deepa ji, could you please come on board?
Yes, thank you so much, Gurpratap. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Today,
And Deepa, do tell us something about the story.
yes, I will. So first, let me tell you the book. The book is, if you can see it, Pilgrims of Sorrow.
You need to be a little louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, your voice is still big. You need to be a little louder. Okay.
Am I loud enough now?
Yeah. Good enough.
Okay. So this is the book, Pilgrims of Sorrow. It's by Inderjeet Paintal. And it's a very interesting concept because each story has a color as a title. So we have a story called White, we have a story called Gray, we have a story. So for example, the story called Green talks about religious animosity. And the story called White is a lot of white imagery, like the white linen shirts and the bhige hue badam, which we all had as kids, and so on. I'm going to be reading a story called Rust, and I think it would make better sense for me to talk about why I'm reading it after I've read it. So let me get started with the story. I hope now I'm loud enough and audible enough.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so I'll get started. Rust. Manjeet was barely 9 at the time of the tragedy, and ever since, he has measured the passage of time in layers of rust. He lost everything and more on that fateful night when the anti-Sikh riots of 1984 broke out in Delhi. He remembers very little from the happy yet brief childhood he spent in his father's garage near Chandni Chowk, just lying in a state of neglect, the weary cars that would rust away. Cats and birds would stake territorial claim over the bonnets, boots, and glove compartments. They would settle in various parts of the rusting cars, and Manjeet clearly remembers the brown shadow of rust encroaching upon the metal like vines creeping up neglected walls. Vines fill up crevices, whereas rust just leaves deep voids and impossible to fill emptiness. He clearly remembers the color of rust on the iron bars in the window of the orphanage, the rusting bars he often held. He would stare into the barren backyard, waiting for no one to come, while his hands just grew bigger around the bars. Manjeet has been trying to shut it out, but the memory of it all remains as constant a companion as his shadow. The smell of charred flesh and the images of thick smoke just refuse to leave his senses, even 25 years later. How can one night last forever? He often screams this question out loud in his solitude. He has run far from the bustling crowds to find the right answer, yet it eludes him. Out here at the Wagah border, in this wilderness imposed by political will, only echoes from his past return to haunt. He has decided on silence to be his soulmate, and he has made a strange truce with his misfortune, a barter for the stolen years of his adolescence and an even more tragic youth. Rust, he believes, is the only constant in his life. It arrives with the dawn and it leaves at dusk, and nothing escapes rust. Even the blue waters rust at dawn and at dusk. A wind cuts through the barbed fence from the other side, complaining loudly of festering wounds. This fence that tells India from Pakistan bisects Wagah village into two halves. These two halves have remained incomplete and unhealed since the partition of India. They are two wailing stumps from the same tree that was severed decades ago. A piece fell on either side of the border. This fencing is now a part of the landscape, a shared view between India and Pakistan, another rusting presence for Manjeet that begs his acceptance. Just like the rusted kitchen knife that led to his wife Harjeet Kaur's death 4 years ago. One timely tetanus shot is all that she needed. But life is vulnerable to ignorance, falling prey to it ever so often. Manjeet is convinced that rust is his insufferable companion, but in the last few months, he has had little reason to complain against rust, for it brought with it the Indian Army Jawans in hordes to work on the project involving the replacement and electrification of the Wagah border fencing. Manjeet's little shop offers BSF Jawans the best tea within a 15-kilometer radius and has been doing roaring business. Apart from good tea, it also provides the Jawans hours of leisure away from the banality and the stifling compulsions of their mess. But these visitors are leaving now, and silence leaves no vacancy. It pours into all available spaces, and these days only regular BSF Jawans saunter in after their shifts of keeping vigil to cut through the mesh of silence. They share jokes, they talk about cricket, politics, and the much-awaited letters from home. Manjeet watches the ring of steam escape the spout of the kettle, taking along with them his fleeting memories. He is pouring tea for Dharam Singh, the burly 6.5-foot tall Jawan. Dharam Singh is certainly not his favorite customer. He hails from the saffron-waving belt of Rajasthan, and the moment that Manjeet sees Dharam's sun-baked face, he is reminded of the sloganeering and imploring cries of '84 that still ring in his ears. Tea leaves the spout of the kettle as Manjeet pours it into the glass held 2 feet below, and every drop of tea falls obediently into the glass. Not a drop dares to spill over the rim of the glass, respecting its borders. Now we come to Dharam. Dharam watches Manjeet flaunt his practiced skill repeatedly. He is contemplating his own role in the sloganeering propaganda at the lowering of the flag ceremony held each evening at the Wagah. Both India and Pakistan display their rehearsed wrath with patriotic fervor during the execution of this animated ritual. Dharam sometimes wonders if he has enlisted to be a stage artist in a theatre troupe. Dharam Singh feels the ache rising to his knee from the base of his heel after yet another exhaustive session of goose stepping and the exchange of unpleasantries with Rahmat Khan, the Pakistani soldier who stands equally tall and is his counterpart at the crescendo moment of the ceremony. Sunlight glints off badges bearing their names as they exchange glances, looking into each other's eyes, measuring and feigning loathing day in and day out to delight a large crowd that assembles on either side of the Wagah border. Having settled into this staring down routine, Dharam has begun to read Rahmat's moods and fears. And he believes Rahmat must be reading into his thoughts as well. Maybe Rahmat can tell that Dharam's wife Gayatri has not sent a letter in the last 2 weeks and that he is missing his 8-year-old son, Ranvijay. Dharam has been carrying the weight of his anxiety on his eyelids each evening to the staring down contest, and he knows that Rahmat's tough exterior is only a charade for the onlookers. When Dharam looks into his brown eyes, they fail to conceal the empathy they extend, one human being to another, not a Pakistani to an Indian. Dharam returns from his thoughts to take refuge in the sips of his sweet milky tea, stronger than usual, brewed to a darker brown, tasting of a dislike that he often senses in Manjeet's behavior. Manjeet's tragic story is often discussed by the Javans in the barracks. Dharam has empathy for the man, but he knows that Manjeet loathes the idea of a Hindu sympathizing with him. The air between them is usually heavy. Silence sits like a paperweight on unsaid words, with neither willing to acknowledge it or to lift it. The sun has quietly slipped out of the ceremony grounds along with the crowds. Even the tough soldiers who raised their decibel levels a few minutes ago now amble back to their quarters, retiring from patriotism.
I think there, yeah.
The same thread lunges into view suddenly. It is a string tied to a kite at one end and to Harjas at the other. Harjas is 9 years old. He is Manjeet's only son and Manjeet is his only parent. Manjeet senses the presence of a thread, hears the hiss of a kite swerving through the wind, and he impulsively looks up into the sky. An indigo slice of the sky is dancing gracefully to the tune of the wind. Manjeet finds a smile in the attic of his heart, usually too filled with grief, because that piece of sky on the move tells him that Harjas is close by. The kite swerves to the right at the behest of a wanton breeze and takes a sharp dip. Harjas has his heart in his mouth for a moment. He knows that Manjeet will not get him a new kite for another whole week. Harjas gets his special kites from Hussain Ustad, the kite maker in Amritsar, only when Manjeet goes to get supplies for his shop, and that is only once a fortnight. Harjas controls it well this time. Instantly, the kite obeys and rustles with an urge to fly again as if strung to Harjas's heart. Dharam's eyes follow the kite with equal keenness and he wears a smile, a master happy to see the progress of his apprentice. He has been teaching Harjas on the sly, but Manjeet has no clue of this alliance. Dharam, too far away from his son, needs more than words and fleeting references in letters from Durgagar to compensate for his son's passing childhood. He yearns for something more tangible. Ever since he held the kite for the first time and taught Harjas how to string and tame the colorful loafer of the skies, a fondness for the boy has taken root in his heart. And now Dharam Singh's eyes follow the kite's moves and he swells with pride to see his apprentice apply the moves he has taught him over the last few months. Music and kite flying are Dharam's passions. He turns up the volume on his radio set that changes loyalties without a prior warning, playing a Lahore station 1 minute and shifting to an Amritsar station the next minute. India and Pakistan, it seems, are at war even in the air that carries the radio waves, fighting for supremacy. But all that the listeners get to hear at the border is a cacophony. But Dharam thinks, the kite is a great dancer. She knows the wind and she knows the music too. She will swerve and she will swoon in perfect sync. And then Dharam Singh squints at the kite against the sun and wonders at the sanity of his own thoughts. He worries that the goose-stepping, the brewing of hatred, and his barren life in the wilderness are driving him insane. Manjeet looks up at the sky and he knows the day will begin to rust soon and the sun will jump over the border fence, leaving a trail of dusk. It is about time he shuts shop for the day. A wind picks up, the rusting pans and metalwares hung at Manjeet's tea stall begin to play like chimes. He looks at the dust cloud building up in the distance and he hastens to close the stall. He thinks of calling out to Harjas to lower the kite and help him. But the warmth of the smile on his son's face just tugs at his heart. And the light of joy shines stronger than the setting sun. Manjeet decides against it. He wants him to enjoy his another 15 minutes with the kite. Dharam too decides to walk back to the barracks and reread the last letter from home, but his eyes never leave the kite and Harjas. As he walks back, he too feels the wind getting stronger, and he too contemplates yelling out to Harjas to get the kite down. But then the thought of Manjeet's disapproval holds him back. He walks on. He does not want to put the child into any sort of trouble. The wind has a different plan. The dusk rushes in as a wandering cloud decides to join the conspiracy. Harjas just remains oblivious to it all. The wind, the dusk, and his destiny. Winds can be cruel to little children, and this one hurries to snatch a boy's precious kite and does so in one stroke. The string comes undone and Harjas looks on helplessly as the wind carries the kite far from him. He realizes that his only kite for a week is going to cross over to the other side of the border. And in one decisive moment, he begins to run after it. His eyes well up, his vision blurs, he keeps running towards the barbed fence. Rehmat, the Pakistani ranger, watches the little boy and his eye automatically peers down the telescope mounted on top of his gun. Dharam Singh turns around to check on the kite and Harjas for one last time, and he sees a silhouette darting across the vast expanse of dry soil, lured by a kite rapidly floating out of his reach. Dharam casts a quick glance at Manjeet, who is busy battling with a rusted lock that secures his tea stall. The key is refusing to turn. Manjeet is oblivious to the fact that his son is running after a kite towards the fence of the border of India and Pakistan. He is within the shooting range of Rehmat Khan, who is on vigil across the border, and Rehmat Khan has standing orders to shoot anyone who attempts to intrude. Dharam assesses the situation and he just darts for Harjas. Meanwhile, the wind lets go of the kite. It now gets entangled into the electrified fence. The twisted barbed wire clasps the string firmly. Harjas sees his helpless kite going in circles and he hastens his tiny steps. Dharam too picks up his pace. Rehmat Khan is staring down the telescope. Beads of sweat begin to form on his tense brow. He feels the same wetness in his palm and the finger on the trigger. Harjas is relieved to see the kite waiting for him to set it free. Manjeet's lock finally relents and the key turns. He turns to call out to Harjas, and what does he see? He sees Dharam Singh darting towards the fence, and as he looks further, he notices Harjas and the tangled kite in the distance. Dharam Singh is aghast to see Harjas reach out for the kite with his hand. He wants to yell, but he can't find his voice. Rehmat Khan is alert and his hand is already on the trigger. He has taken aim and he has closed one eye. Manjeet breaks into a frantic run behind Dharam. The dust storm arrives to take everything in its fold and helps the kite break free from the fence. Dharam kneels down and he cries with his face in his hands. He is yelling out his own son's name, Run Vijay. Manjeet falls to the ground. Rehmat Khan lowers his head behind the gun. He drops his weapon, kneels on the ground and raises both hands in prayer. Harjas lies electrocuted by the fence in Dharam's arms. A kite sails across the border while a dying sun paints the sky rust. Thank you. That's my story. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And I'd like to now discuss why I chose to read this book. Number one, I share the author's disdain for the Wagah border ceremony. I live in Amritsar. I have been to the Wagah border ceremony once and I do not think I want to go back. Because when I went, I just felt it was so sad, the way you have to use so much aggression to evoke patriotism. And secondly, I believe that borders and divisions always claim innocent victims, and this story just goes on to show that. Personally, I, in school, read Tagore's poem, Where the Mind is Without Fear, and I would like to live in a world where the world has not been broken up into narrow domestic walls, I think it was. But then in this era of populist governments around the world with their divisive agendas, that seems to be actually fading away. So I just think that this story has relevance in these times. So that's why I wanted to share it.
Thanks, Deepa. Yeah, really. I agree with you completely, and also the way the story built up the tension towards the end. It sort of began very in an easy kind of flow, and then even with your reading, you made that tension come alive. So thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Gurpratap, who do we have next?
We have some joy, but I wanted to talk to Deepa about the story, and I found the story to be very dramatic, especially towards the end where the tension becomes very palpable. And I found the names also very interesting. Manjeet, Ranvijay, Rehmat, Dharam.
So I guess because it's about the Wagah border and Chandani Chowk, so the names were pretty much in sync with the whole
I think so.
atmosphere of the book. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Deepa.
The author is from Jalandhar, so maybe that is
Acha.
that familiarity. So.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right.
The reader that we have today is Sanjoy Hazarika. And since he has been joining us for many Majha House programs, I believe you are all familiar with him. And today we are going to see him in a different avatar altogether, and he's going to read a piece for us. Sanjoy Hazarika is currently the International Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, that is CHRI, which has offices in London, Accra, and has ECOSOC status. Mr. Hazarika anchors the South Asia Media Defenders Network. Samdeb is a human rights activist, columnist, and an award-winning former reporter with the New York Times. He is the author of several books, including most recently, Strangers No More, New Narratives from the Northeast. Mr. Hazarika was the founder director of the Center for Northeast Studies and the Policy Research at Jamia Millia Islamia. He pioneered the unique boat clinics initiative on the Brahmaputra River in Assam, which has reached 2 million people with health care. He was a member of the Justice Jeevan Reddy Committee to review the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and a former member of the National Security Advisory Board. In addition to being a commentator, he also has made more than a dozen films on rights and conflict, including on Mizoram, Nagaland, and Assam, as well as one of the endangered Gangetic dolphins of the Brahmaputra. So now we have a story. I believe he's going to read a prose piece. Sanjoy?
Thank you, Gurpratap, and thank you, Majha House, for inviting me again in quick succession to my moderating yesterday piece sign-up, which I found quite extraordinary experience. And I thank everybody who's participating in this program. I'm going to read from, this is my book, Strangers No More, that Gurpratap referred to, published in 2018 by Eller. And it's chapter 4, A Troubled Peace in Mizoram. The Indian Army brigadiers stood by the recently dug up grave. 2 highly decomposed bodies had been pulled out of the pit, covered by grass and shrubs on a hillside. The officer was in deep emotional distress, for one of the bodies was supposed to be that of his son. He was no ordinary army officer, and one of the bodies that had been exhumed was of no ordinary soldier. It was of a soldier, all right, but one who had been in the service of the very forces fighting those represented by his father. It could have been a scene out of a movie. It wasn't. It was an episode from hard-knuckle life, and the father was mourning his son. He had come from Shillong, then capital of composite Assam, in a helicopter bearing an empty coffin. Earlier that day in 1967, his wife was scheduled to undergo surgery, but when they got news of their son's death, the operation was cancelled. His wife went home in tears, and the brigadier took to the air to reach the Mizo Hills. It's all in the game, the brigadier had told a compatriot earlier in the day. This was an operation against the underground. The troops have done their duty. But he was not that composed. He recalled in his memoirs, musing on the 15-minute road trip from the helipad to the village where the bodies had been interred, he recalled, it was a long journey. Here was I, sitting all by myself, by the side of a coffin at my feet. men to carry back the dead body of my son. For this slightly built, kind-faced, but incredibly tough professional soldier who had been in hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese in World War II, carried out strikes, espionage, and organized a guerrilla campaign in the Chin Hills of Burma, those written words were akin to a cry of utter despair. Some 22 months earlier, his son had left their home, college, and the town where he had been living, Shillong, in response to a call to arms by a rebel leader who had proclaimed independence from India in the Mizo Hills district. At the time, he stood 6'4", very tall for a Mizo, and any person from the northeast inhabited by sturdy but mostly small-statured people. Renouncing his Indianness, the teenager enlisted in the Mizoram National Volunteers and then trained with a growing number of youth under a group of tough instructors, men who had been discharged from the Assam regiment a couple of years earlier. A date for the uprising was set. On 28th February 1966, the call to arms was sounded under the biblical name of Operation Jericho. An army of not less than 20,000 men, both armed and unarmed, overran the district, almost captured all of Aizawl, the capital, including the treasury, all government offices, and the All India Radio, the government broadcaster. Only one little hillock resisted the power of the young Mizos as the doughty Assam Rifles unit fought back and refused to surrender. Within a few days, the government of India hit back, ordering airstrikes to the Air Force's Canberras, which dropped incendiary bombs and strafed Aizawl and other towns and villages. Lal Sangliana, that was his name, better known as Sangliana, the brigadier's son, and others from the Mizo National Army and the Mizo National Volunteers got out well before the strikes, as they had had an inkling of what could be in store, for helicopters had earlier dropped water and other supplies to the beleaguered Assam Rifles garrison with air cover from jet fighters. Brigadier T. Silo, that was the father's name, was surprised by the voice of the village chief who had approached him. As the bodies were lifted, the village elder whispered into the army officer's ear, "This is not Sanglia. These are the bodies of Larika and Rosidinga. Lal Sangliana is alive." The startled father decided not to say anything, for he knew this could bring the local army unit's wrath down on the village. He was well aware of what his compatriots were capable of doing. All hell would be let loose on the villagers, the informant feared. So Silo said nothing, although he realized immediately that neither of the highly decomposed bodies could be that of his son, as Sangliana was 6'4" tall. These MNF fighters were much shorter. He took one body with him for a proper church burial to Aizawl in the same helicopter in which he had come. But the drama wasn't over. The real Sangliana was not only alive, but he was present, a short distance from the crowd, watching through thickets. As his father arrived, first stoic and grieving, and then stunned and relieved before leaving. Sangliana had told himself when he went to the jungles that he would be lucky if he was alive the following Christmas. The next part is has been overtaken by events because Sangliana passed away last year. but I'll read it because it tells you a very important part of his life. 40 years later, burly but weakened by 2 strokes, the former guerrilla fighter said he still believed in the rights of the Mizos to a separate homeland and Burma. This remains an imaginary land um, that he and others who believe in it call Zomi, and their movement is called Zomi Reunification. His father passed away at the age of 92 peacefully in his own bed in Aizawl in 2015. And after that, Sangyana lived in that house with his wife, sons, daughter-in-law, and 2 huge Saint Parliaments. Dreams don't die. Sangyana passed away last year, as I said. So this is really a tribute to him as to anything else. And why I'm reading this is because I'll tell you, I'll read another bit because there's still a little time. Because my introduction and my journey to the work I do in the Northeast have done in the Northeast over many years, really started from a conversation in a bus with a young Mizo singer. And I'll read this part to you. My initial understanding of the sadness and trauma that has gripped so many individuals and communities in the area we call the Northeast came from a young Mizo blessed with a beautiful voice, Joseph Zokunga, who was a rock singer in Shillong, where he also studied. He was 22 when I first met him, and I was not a little in awe of him, especially because of his popularity as a singer. He wasn't good looking, stocky, with a walk that resembled a bird hopping, and a mop of sharp hair. As I traveled with him to a student conference near Bombay in 1970, I remember him telling me the story that started my journey to learn about our region and why things are the way they are and whether they can become any better. On that bus journey from Shillong to Guwahati, when we were to catch a train on the long journey to Bombay through the blazing May heat of central India, Joseph told me about how his father, a man who earned money for his family, repairing radios and transistors, had been picked up by an army patrol from a shop in Aizawl on suspicion of being a supporter or informer of the Mizo National Army. He was beaten severely and tortured. The soldiers crushed his father's fingers, Joseph said, by stamping on them, destroying the fingers that sustained the family. I recall that conversation as if it were yesterday, just as I also remember my anger at what governments and soldiers do with such seamless impunity. But I also found it hard to absorb. There is a great helplessness when you're a teenager coming to terms with the world and its ugliness while dreaming of great visions of reshaping society. A few years later, I went to meet Joseph, but he was not there, having lost a battle with cancer. But I met his brother and sister, and his sister said to me, he kept talking about you all the time and always referred to your book. This was the first book, which was called Strangers of the Mist. She went to a cupboard and pulled out a copy of Strangers. I would be happy to inscribe it, I said, but then I found, leaping from the pages of the book, lines that I had written more than 20 years earlier, thanking Joseph for starting me on this journey. It was moving and strange. It felt as if he was there. Thank you.
Excellent, Sanjoy, excellent. I'm unmuting Preeti ji and Gurpratap. So it was a wonderful deep insight about Mizoram. Please, Gurpratap.
Acha, okay. I was waiting for Preeti to start. Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you for that wonderful piece. And your personal memories are attached to these pieces. I know that. And it must bring all the memories back of those times.
Yeah, well, the thing is that it's not, those are stories which were not even stories to me when I first learned about them. I found it very hard to believe that these sort of things were happening in our country. And it's been a very long journey and a very challenging journey to understand. And what I'm really grateful for is the fact that I have so many friends in Mizoram who are warm and wonderful and open and understanding of that challenge, that problem. I made a film. Preeti and I have collaborated in making a film called Ramboy, The Troubled Years. And there is now a new literature about which I'll be speaking. And I'm very glad that some of our friends from Mizoram are here in this conversation and listening to this. It's called Ramboy literature, which is the year. Ramboy is, in the Mizo language, the years of trouble, because there is no exact word for that terrible time that people went through. And it is so difficult to talk about that many people don't talk about it, did not talk about it to their children or their grandchildren, but kept it to themselves, locked to themselves. And it's only in the last 10 years that this is coming out. The first novel has been written in English. There is material that's being documented by different groups. So it's a work in progress, and it's a remarkable catharsis of a society coming to address the challenges that it has faced. And something that we can all learn from.
Yeah. Because the sad fact is that most of us in the rest of India do not really come to know about these kind of things that are happening right in our own country.
Yeah,
and
that's why people like me are around.
And it's only through...
Anyway, the good thing is that both the stories, one fiction, one non-fiction, actually talked about people and the states that they live in and the wars they are often forced to fight. So yeah, wonderful. Fiction and non-fiction coming together with the similar kind of theme. Poonam.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you so much. Our next reader now is Poonam Bevil Sahi. She is a graphic designer, artist, avid traveler, and of course, a voracious reader. Poonam, what are you going to read for us today?
I will be reading a story from Geeta Hariharan's The Art of Dying. She is the author of several books, also for children. Her novels have been nominated for the Booker Prize and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, which she subsequently won in 1992 for the 1,000 Faces of Night. I will be reading a story called Reverie, which will hopefully resonate with a lot of you and make you think. It's a story, it's an everyman story. It could be an everyman story. So here goes, Reverie. Sorry, it's called The Reprieve. The Reprieve. Alone in his room, wide awake again in the dead of night, Nagaraj Rao tried to conjure up the image of his wife. It was not as if he had a poor or failing memory, though he was 72 years old. And it was not as if Mangala had died so long ago that he had trouble remembering her. Since he had moved away from the town in which they had lived, since he had been moved by his eldest son who said his frail father was his responsibility, away from the old house in which they had spent all their 50 odd married years, Nagaraj Rao found himself thinking of Mangala more and more of the time. It had become something of an obsessive settling of accounts, a stock taking and reordering of the memories, a final attempt, or rather, a belated attempt to know the woman who had been his wife. 53 years, he thought, and how did she escape me so completely? Nagaraj's life had been cluttered with other people's problems. He was an advocate. Every morning, the front porch swelled with anxious clients. He was a man who could listen, and he also spent a lifetime refining his sense of justice. He read voraciously, but his success as a lawyer was actually the direct consequence of a fine, keen perception, an extra sense that smelt out wrongdoing. Over the years, in and out of court, he had learned to distinguish the genuine cases, the needy relatives, the unfairly hounded from the parasites and slick imposters. So it was with a sense of shock, even disbelief, that Nagaraj Rao found himself in the defendant's dock. Even if self-accused, he was all the same liable to cross-examination. If a widower, an old man under the protection of a young family, he felt the absence of Mangala like a physical pain, what had he felt about her as a husband? Had they become one as he had promised in the vows made while walking round the marital fire? He had been a good provider. He had handed over to his wife his lawyer's fees and the earnings he collected from the family fields of sugarcane in a distant village. And Mangala had administered, run the house without fuss, and he assumed with competence. In his defense then, he provided. He had fathered children. He had never interfered in the day-to-day running of the house. But what actually happened? And why was he ransacking his memories for evidence for and against now? Mangala had come to the old ancestral home as a 15-year-old bride. If she missed her parents, her brothers and sisters, the games of her recent childhood, her husband heard nothing of it. She was not particularly beautiful, but her features were not displeasing, and her skin was a pleasant and smooth pale brown. She must, and in fact have been considered pretty, though not enough to get either enraptured by or alarmed about. Mangala grew to be an adult, and she grew to be something very much like her look. Pleasant, patient, hardworking, selfless, discreet, essentially faceless, an elusive middle-of-the-road woman who did not attract attention for either her shortcomings or her virtues. For 50 years, she had been good, or at least unobtrusive wife in the background. She had run the machinery of a 30-member household, had oiled its creaky joints, though Nagaraj Rao had been responsible for the larger, more obvious task of providing the components of the machinery. The family members who would be a part of the fold, the hierarchy. Then the children grew up in batches, their own, and the cousins, and left. Jobs and marriages taking them to different towns, cities, even countries. The old pillars, a child widow who had spent her life running the kitchen, two bachelor uncles, a retarded nephew who lived till he was 40, died. In the few years, the machinery, built so painstakingly and with such unquestioned belief in the family, lay idle, obsolete. Mangala and Nagaraj Rao now lived alone. But as if the basis of her existence had been questioned, the purpose of her womanhood destroyed, Mangala became seriously ill. She was discovered to be an undiagnosed diabetic. She developed high blood pressure, and finally, as if to put a seal on her fate, the doctor suspected cancer. She died as she had lived, nothing ugly or sudden, just a slow, lingering, inconspicuous bundle of well-disguised pain, the flesh slowly, but not offensively disintegrating, more and more gaunt and faded, till the end came like a gracious blessing one night, a night like any other, when Nagaraja Rao and the servants slept. He had spent another 6 months in the house, alone except for one servant, but he had thought very little of Mangala. He felt, of course, a grief appropriate for to a new widower, but his conscious, demanding thoughts had to do with his retirement. He had finally agreed that he was too old to go to the courts every day, and he was busy completing files, handing over cases to the junior he had groomed, saying goodbye to a life he had lived with relish and involvement almost all his adult years. A few weeks after he retired, his son insisted that Nagaraja Rao move to his flat in Bombay, where he would be looked after and where he would not be a source of either guilt or worry to his children. Nagaraja Rao had resisted, then resigned himself to the move. Certainly he had not expected that the change of setting, the move to an alien city, would cast such a radically altered hue on his past. It was as if the flat, a small, intimate one in which the nuclear family, husband, wife, small child, was the all-pervasive force, narrowed his own focus. He no longer thought of clients and cases, family fees, the inner outer circles of relatives. Now in his 70s, in a small flat, far away from his town, in the midst of a family nothing like the one he had known, he thought, perhaps for the first time, of what had been, or what could have been of Mangala, even of romantic love. Had he missed something finer, more essential in his pursuit of justice, and in his well-deserved leadership of an untidy, amorphous family? He heard his son and daughter-in-law talking in whispers hours after they had switched off their bedroom lights. He stared hard at the wall that separated his room and theirs. What did they talk about? It seemed to him that Mangala and he talked only about the children or the many problems of the household. Had she wondered about his cases, his life away from and independent of the household? Had she been lonely, or too busy, or tired, or vacuous to care? Nagaraj Rao always had a room of his own in the old house, his office it was called, because it was lined with bookshelves and had an impressive writing desk. And he had slept there on an old wooden four-poster cot, a mosquito net tucked firmly under the mattress on all sides. Perhaps they had slept in the same room in the early years, but he could only remember years and years of comfortable nights in his own mosquito net shrouded bed, quietly, blissfully alone, after a long day in which clients, judges, competitors, old uncles talked and pushed their way into the field of vision. Mangala had slept in the big room on the ground floor, rows of children on either side. Had she missed him some nights? Had she wanted to steal up the stairs once they had all breathed evenly in the sale house? Restlessly, he got out of bed and stole out of the room into the dark, narrow passage. His son had left the door of their room ajar. Trembling a little, like a poor man at a rich relative's feast, he peeped in. Did they sleep side by side? Or did the child sleep in between? Did she sleep in his arms? What did her long, lustrous hair smell like? In the darkness, he could make out nothing but three bodies covered with pale sheets, just as his wife had been in the morning he found her dead. In terror, Nagaraj Rao inched back to the familiar refuge of his empty room. Drenched in sweat, his tongue a dry sponge, he crawled into his bed and pushed the warm sheets away from his body. She is dead, he thought, and he felt first an astonishment, then a shock of pain in his chest. Here I am alive and filled with a longing more insistent than I have ever known, and Mangala is dead. Slowly, slowly, with years of self-discipline standing by him, he willed himself to stop trembling. He wiped his wet face with a handkerchief gently, tenderly, and lay down, his eyes closed. What had Mangala dreamt about a few days before she died? He had woken to the sound of a shrill giggle, and he had found it fast asleep, a girl's smile stretching her pinched, wrinkled face. Years ago, she must have been barely 20. He had seen that smile on a younger face. Her sister was getting married, and Mangala was packing to go to the wedding. Surrounded by rich silk, boxes of jewelry, presents for nieces and nephews, Mangala had looked up at him when he had walked into the room. She could hardly suppress her excitement. For a moment, she seemed to have forgotten the restrained look she had been tutored to assume as mistress of the house. And in this sudden reversion to girlhood, she had smiled, a radiant, welcoming smile, and held out an arm to him. Will you come too? Please come. It will be such fun. He had been surprised, especially by the word fun. But he had also been amused. Why, the woman was a child. But he could not go, of course. There was simply no question of a fortnight away from a court at that time of the year. Nagaraj Rao groaned as he turned over, waiting with an equal measure of dread and eagerness for what he would remember next. He finally slept in the early hours of the morning, his jaw hanging loose, his face sagging with exhaustion. When he woke up, the flat was unusually quiet. Then he looked at the clock on the wall and realized that his son must have already left for office and his grandson for the nursery school. He waited, listening to the loud ticking in the stillness, and then heard the low humming in the kitchen, soft and inviting, and the rhythmic tapping of a knife against the chopping board. He began to sweat again, but this time he was not afraid. He breathed deeply, his body filling with the surge of expectation, his mounting excitement. He went stumbling to the kitchen, forgetting his walking stick by the bed. He stopped by the kitchen door and stared intently at the bent figure of his humming daughter-in-law, her freshly washed hair streaming down her back. I have to know, he said, and stopped, his voice sounding unnatural to him, feverish and high-pitched. Then she turned around and he saw Mangala's face, smooth, young, her upper lip glistening and moist as it had been when she bent over the kitchen fire or when her arms locked around his neck. He saw her look of surprise and he thought in quick gasps of grief, let me look at her, let me look at her. Quick, memorize every inch of her face, the shade of her eyes, the shape of her nose and lips, the small mole on her chin. He took a step forward, stumbled, and felt at the same instant an exquisite pain that began high up in his forehead and shot through the length of his body to his feet. Mangala, he called in a frenzy of excitement, rapture, gratitude. Mangala, wait, he wanted to say, so he couldn't. But she knew, she understood, and she quickly came to him, her face full of tender concern. A reprieve, he thought, the grateful tears spilling out of his eyes, and as the pain gripped his chest again, he fell into the dark safety of her outstretched arms. So that was Reprieve from the Art of Dying by Geeta Hariharan.
Thank you, Poonam. Thank you. That was a very, very poignant and touching story. Why did you choose this story? Why do you like it so much?
It actually, I thought it could be every man's story. Men get so involved in their careers, in everything else perhaps, but women. I think often women feel very neglected, to hear just a tender word, an affectionate endearment, I think is all that a man, that a woman needs. And I felt that perhaps this man had a little bit of regret that he didn't do enough of that, and he missed the finer feelings that she could have evoked in him or had evoked in him, and he ignored perhaps.
You know, this story reminded me of a recent movie starring Meryl Streep and Tommy Lee Jones, Hope Springs. It is about a couple in which the woman yearns for the affection that her husband showed in the early years of the marriage.
I thought it was a film that it was a story that would really resonate with a lot of people, and perhaps a little bit of introspection might start.
From us folks.
Something good might come out of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was really, really wonderful. Thank you, Poonam.
Excellent, Poonam. Excellent.
Our last reader member for today is Azam Gill. Azam Gill, teacher, novelist, and news analyst, is a retired teacher in English, Toulouse University, France. His PhD dissertation, The Effect of Faulkner's Flags in the Dust, received Summa Cum Laude from Stendhal University, France, and has been published by the University of Michigan. Served with distinction in the French Foreign Legion, the French Navy, and the Punjab Regiment, with service in Africa and on the line of control in Kashmir. He is the author of 8 books, including 3 thrillers, blood money, flight to Pakistan, and blasphemy, the incident. Numerous articles and features as a contributing editor for The Big Thrill. Over to you, Azam Gill, and do tell us something about your story that you're going to read today.
First of all, thank you so much for the introduction, and double check, is my voice clear?
Yeah.
It is. It is.
Yeah, okay, okay. And thank you, Majha House and the Majha House team for making this all possible. About the story, I extracted one of the stories from my unpublished manuscript, which is called Diptisar, which is biographical fiction and focuses on the survival of a renowned Christian magistrate in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. I hope I've tried to make it as brief as possible, and I hope it has worked. The story is called the Changa Manga Culling Party. The Changa Manga Culling Party. 1962 was an eventful year. Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard went into space. A wall divided Berliners. The Bay of Pigs smeared egg on Kennedy's pretty face so he could start the Peace Corps and the Green Berets. A Clockwork Orange and Lolita made publishing headlines. Hollywood's Lawrence of Arabia, The Longest Day, To Kill a Mockingbird, and The Manchurian Candidate earned critical acclaim and influenced mindsets. And Brian Hyland sang. Although red circled by Khrushchev, Pakistan was not immune to these influences, hovering over a rural dinner party of district officers in a rest house. That evening in 1962, A.P. Gill, Section 30 magistrate, was in the Forest Department's Changa Manga rest house. Shabaz Gundal, the forest officer, had invited all the district officers to dinner. A log blazed in the grate. They sat at the laden dining table, attended by liveried staff in turbans and sashes. The walls were covered with hunting trophies and bladed weapons. Sparkling linen, crystalware, and porcelain made a fitting reception for the 5-course fusion meal prepared by the celebrated chef Qudratullah Khan. He called it the governor's menu, greatly appreciated by Sir Sikandar Hayat, the last British governor of the Punjab. It started with chicken soup, followed by fried rau machi, tandoori bhatere, shami kebab, and led to a superbly roasted joint, preceding a crisp salad, fruit custard, and black forest cake. The dining room was filled with the smell of exotic spices, low-key rattle of cutlery, and muted conversation. Gilsab Afzal Bajwa, the land revenue Tahsildar, asked through the full-mouthed chatter, Khrushchev ne Pakistan de gird laal leak diti hai. Hamle da kinna ka khatra je? Gill raised a palm as he inserted a forkful of the juicy roast into his mouth. Imtiaz Kharl, the smooth, well-barbered Special Branch Deputy Police Superintendent, replied, मेरा ख्याल है गिल साहब मनणगे कि पाकिस्तान ਨੂੰ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਜਸੂਸੀ ਜਹਾਜ਼ ਦੀ ਉਡਾਰੀਆਂ ਕਬੂਲ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਸਾਡੀ ਪੈਰਵੀ ਵੀ ਕਰੇਗਾ ਉਹ ਜਨਾਬ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦਾ ਡਾਲਰਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਹੱਥ ਖੁੱਲਾ ਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਡਾਲਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਪਰਹੇਜ਼ ਹੀ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ Shabaz Gundal cheerfully added from the head of the table. And the laughter rippled across the laden table at Kamal Dil Bhuttar, the executive engineer's wit. And if President Kennedy loses the next election, how Pakistan will survive? Gill had finished swallowing his meat now, and with knife and fork ready for the next morsel, paused and looked up. Nothing can happen to the fundamentals of American policy. He and his beautiful wife will probably go on a world tour, talk peace and friendship, but the United States' Soviet policies will continue. They all nodded. Sarwar Kohli, the jail superintendent, wiped the sparkle of keo off his mustache and raised an eyebrow. Oh, Gill Saab, we will invite the Kennedys to Changa Manga. John Saab can go hunting, and we will look after the Lady Jackie bus. The table rippled with laughter. And you, Gill Saab, can go to your church and pray for us. This time the table exploded with laughter. 50 square kilometers of Changamanga make it the biggest seeded forest in the world. Only 80 kilometers southwest of Lahore, the forest was planted in 1866 to fulfill the need for timber and fuel for the northwestern British railways. At nearly 50 square kilometers of it. It is now a wildlife preserve for hog deer, peacocks, jackals, mouflon sheep, wild boar, and nilgai antelopes. Changamanga is also an attractive tourist destination, despite being known as a hiding place for the occasional outlaw. The forest was managed by the Forest Department, which also ran the internal sightseeing railway and maintained a few rest houses. In 1962, Changamanga was a thana or police station of Kasur subdivision of Lahore district. A.P. Gill, being Kasur's only magistrate at that time, Changamanga and all its facilities came under his jurisdiction. It allowed him to use the Forest Department's installations for as many personal visits as he wished. Although a crack shot and a keen hunter, Gill never thought to abuse his privileges and hunt game within the confines of the wildlife preserve. And of course, he punished poachers mercilessly. Based in Kasur, only 30 miles from Lahore, he saw his family at weekends, either in Lahore or in Kasur. This way, the children could avail themselves of Lahore's schooling and its rich cultural life of libraries, poetry recitals, music concerts, and theatre. So, Kasur, the 23rd of December. Gill's orderly had packed his small holdall and a wicker basket filled with Kasur's famous mathai. He now waited for his friend, Pastor James Iqbal, who would give him a lift to Lahore in his car. There was a knock on the door. Humming a Christmas carol under his breath, Gill went to answer it. He looked into Shabazz Gondal's broad, gold-toothed smile. Behind him was the servant carrying a rectangular wicker basket. What's this, Takallaf, Gondal Saab? Happy Christmas venison, Gondal replied, eyes twinkling. Gill's face slowly suffused with anger. Where did you get it from? Changamanga forest, Gondal replied, deadpan. Bilkul mana hai. Gill growled in Urdu, the language of official authority, and Gondal wondered if they'd gone too far with the man. And am I to become complicit in a crime? He stared hard at Gondal. Gill Saab, if you allow me, you are already complicit in the crime. Gill scowled. Then his brow cleared, he smiled, and they both broke into laughter. The roast at the dinner last week, that was venison too. Of course, you're a bunch of scoundrels, especially you. Gill Saab, you know very well the reputation of Gondals as part-time, only part-time hereditary criminals. And before the British, Changa Manga belonged to my ancestors, the dacoit brothers Changa and Manga. Gill chuckled. Then, eyes twinkling, asked, what are the rules for culling herds? Forest officer's discretion, Gill Saab. In that case, I can only thank the forest officer and the forest department for their generosity. You are more than welcome. And that's half a deer, so you can share with friends for Happy Christmas. By the way, we all know you are a keen hunter and a crack shot. Would you like to help us out in our culling parties? Of course, especially since they're at your discretion. Both men were still laughing when Pastor James Iqbal turned up. Thank you once again, Majha House, and thank you, the distinguished company.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you. That was simply delightful. And
Honestly.
Thank you,
story
sir.
and the way you emphasized the dialogue, that was really fun. Lots of fun.
Yeah, I really loved it. And I think that drama of bringing in the Punjabi dialogues into your English story really worked very well. And you have not lost your accent. Good to see that.
नहीं नहीं मैंने जेड़ा भी बंदा मिलता है मेरे नाल बोलता है ਉਹਨੂੰ ਯਕੀਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ 40 ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਮੈਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਜੱਦੀ ਪੁਸ਼ਤੀ ਸਰਜ਼ਮੀਨ ਤੇ ਪੈਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਰੱਖਿਆ
अच्छा, oh really?
ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਮੁਹਾਵਰੇ ਵੀ ਉਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੋਲਣਾ ਅਗਲੇ ਦਿਨ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਟੈਲੀਫੋਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਕਹੋ ਛੱਡ ਯਾਰ ਟਰਕੀ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਛੱਡ ਜ਼ਾਤ ਦੀ ਕੋੜ ਕਿੱਲੀ ਸ਼ਕੀਰੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਜੱਫੇ ਉਹਦਾ ਹਾਸਾ ਨਾ ਰੁਕਿਓ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਫੋਨ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਯਾਦ
Yeah. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Azam. That was
so
wonderful.
much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Yes. I think we've had good fun with all the 4 stories, all extremely different. I mean, 1 non-fiction, 3 fiction, 2 written and read by the writers themselves, and 2 others. Yeah, thank you very much for a lovely evening. Gurpratap, where are you? You've disappeared.
He's here only.
आप thank you बोलिए. और next on the 10th we have a wonderful session on Manto and Mantoiyat. So please do come for that. Good Pratap.
And on behalf of Majha House, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the members who came as audience, and of course to all our reader members who selected their.
Excuse me, but aren't you going to even ask the audience if they have any questions, criticism, comments, or anything?
Yes, of course.
The
I
4
think
of us have read, and surely you need to give other people a chance.
Sarabjot had a comment, and if he's here, maybe we can ask him to join.
One hand raised also.
Yeah. Sarabjot, are you here?
Let me see. Let me see.
Yeah, he's there.
Okay.
Yeah.
See him.
I'm just going to unmute him. Yeah, Sarabjotji, Dr. Bell, please unmute yourself, sir. Dr. Bell, please unmute yourself. I think probably this gadget is on, but then.
I think Gurupesh also said something in the chat.
Yeah, he asked a question and then Sanjoy replied.
Okay, so that's done.
Yeah, the question was resolved. Anyway, everybody in the participants did enjoy all this wonderful session of the all four stories. As Preeti said, two written and read by the writers, and of course, Deepa and Poonam, they also did very well. And since all the appreciations to all the four readers today.
Well, we are also, I'm very happy that friends from Aizawl, I can see at least 3 or 4 have joined us. So I'm delighted that they could be there. I'm speaking next week or the week after to in the university, the college in Aizawl, so on the issue of Rambai literature, and I want to look at it in terms of resistance literature from different parts of the world, conflict literature, resistance.
We do have a number of messages in the chat, and I'll read them briefly. Azam, this is for you from Dr. Gurudeh Singh. He also retired as a professor of English from GNDU Amritsar. And he says that he found your mix of English and Desi Punjabi very interesting.
Thank you.
And regarding your Ma Boli and the dialect that you have not forgotten, Ms. Nayyar says that she finds it interesting, and she also says that koi bhi Ma Boli nahi bhulda.
Yes.
And Simran Pentel has said that all delightful stories, beautifully read, lots to think about. Thank you.
Can I say something, please?
Yeah.
Of course, of course. Please.
Yes. First thing is about the story about Assam. Just 2 incidental points. I have a first cousin who was an officer in the Assam Rifles, and he is my first cousin, and I have family in Jammu, and voila. Major Majid Singh. He has a Sikh name from which they converted, but he has no English name stuck next to it, so from the name it's hard to tell. And the other thing is there's a book called Distant Drums by Manohar Malgonkar. And Manohar Malgonkar lately seems to have gone out of fashion, but if somebody wants to read it, that would make a lovely link, because he lived in the jungles of Assam when he retired, somewhere around there in the northeastern jungles, maybe if it wasn't Assam. And he wrote about the Vaga situation, which was also brought about. And as a former soldier, it is to my deep embarrassment that both armies, which are professional armies and renowned for their professionalism, have to go through this ridiculous charade. The aggression in the story is in the crowds. I've never been to Vaga since they started this tamasha. We used to go there when we were kids, and I remember when this is my father, the story is about, A.P. Gill. When he was in Kasur, Ganda Singh border came under his jurisdiction, and he used to be quite sentimental, standing over there and saying that, the marker of the Gills in the 14th century is in Firozpur district, which is opposite, and either we should have gone to India or Firozpur should have been with us, stuff like that. And on that Vaga border, what the soldiers do, I would dearly love to know, of the 2 armies, in that charade they do those Bollywood scowls and those silly gestures.
You should talk.
Am I taking too much time? Please give me a hint if I'm taking too much time. Sunil Bhaskar, oh goodness gracious me, did a report on that, and he said they all must come from the Ministry of Silly Marches, because when they are not at Vaga, they do not march into that exaggerated goose step. I say again, they are professionals. I spent 4 years on the line of control, and I have the deepest respect for the Indian Army, which was so professional. In those days, there were no, it was different. I'm talking of the late 70s. Mid-70s to the end of the 70s, and ranks were saluted. I was an officer, I got saluted. And I had my nameplate over here when we were patrol, and we passed close by, and when there were Sikhs in the patrol, they'd look at my name and they'd say, "Gel lo tusi otthe ki pe karde ho, aayo idhar. Fasla edda koi nahi, aa jao sade." And they knew that alcohol was banned, and often they gave me, I don't know whether it was out of pity or friendship, but they gave me a water bottle of rum of their ration. And I, of course, did not offer them cigarettes in return. When there weren't cigars, I offered. Anyway, I've taken up more time than I should have, but that is what the context of the story is brought into focus, that aggression over there is among the public. Funnily enough, you take the same people, take them back to Lahore. You have any one of you going through Lahore at any time and saying, "Asi India to aaya," people will jump on you as a bottle piyo, bismillah, aayo, Hindustan to aaya, nahi, nahi, nahi jana. Unless you buy something very expensive, they won't take any money for it. They will, or if it's something really expensive, they'll give you a discount or Coca-Cola or something. But I don't know whose head it came in to scowl, and they're not actors. These things are done by actors. They are paid to act. These soldiers are not actors. They've been put in the silly acting position. Anyway, thank you. That's
Thank you.
Thank you for the anecdote.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Good night. Goodbye from Majha House.
Okay. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
evening.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you all.
Thank you.
Panelists, all participants. Thank you, Preeti and Majha House. Good.